When I was 25, I got testicular cancer and nearly died. I was given less than a 40% chance of surviving, and frankly, some of my doctors were just being kind when they gave me those odds. Death is not exactly cocktail party conversation, I know, and neither is cancer, or brain surgery, or matters below the waist. But I'm not here to make polite conversation. I want to tell the truth. I'm sure you'd like to hear about how Lance Armstrong became a great American and an inspiration to us all, how he won the Tour de France, the 2,290-mile road race that's considered the single most grueling sporting event on the face of the earth. You want to hear about faith and mystery and my miraculous comeback, and how I joined towering figures like Greg LeMond and Miguel Indurain in the record books. You want to hear about my lyrical climb through the Alps, and my heroic conquering of the Pyrenees and how it felt, but the tour was the least of the story. Most of it is not easy to tell or comfortable to hear. I'm asking you now at the outset to put aside your ideas about heroes and miracles, because I'm not storybook material. This is not Disneyland or Hollywood. I'll give you an example. I've read that I flew up the hills and mountains of France, but you don't fly up a hill. You struggle slowly and painfully up a hill. And maybe if you work very hard, you get to the top ahead of everybody else. And this is an excerpt from the book we're going to talk about today. It's Not About the Bike by Lance Armstrong and Sally Jenkins.
Welcome to Performers, the podcast that takes you into the minds of the world's most extraordinary athletes, coaches and performers. We're your hosts. I'm Dr. Greg Young, and you've just heard from Dr. Duncan Simpson. As sports psychology experts, we'll guide you through the pages of their autobiographies, revealing the mindsets, strategies and habits that propelled the world's best to the pinnacle of their fields. Our goal is to help you learn from history's greatest performers. For each episode, we read and then condense entire autobiographies into concentrated insights, representing over 20 hours of work per episode. You not only gain the collective wisdom of these elite performers, but also access to over 30 years of our professional expertise in sports psychology. Listening to this, you're saving countless hours while accessing the distilled wisdom and proven strategies of the best in their fields.
Now, Greg, I'm not great at math, but we have listeners in 53 countries and now thousands of downloads, but a total of 43 five-star reviews across Spotify and Apple. It seems like we have some freeloaders here.
Definitely got some freeloaders. It's obvious we do, but we still love you. If you haven't had a chance to give us 5 stars and take a moment to write a review, please pause it now and do so. Just a couple of sentences. It really helps us grow the show. Now back to you.
Greg, I've always been a fan of Lance Armstrong, even though I wasn't much of a cycling fan. I think, like many people in the US, I supported Lance, especially given his battle with cancer, which is a deeply personal issue to me since I lost my dad to cancer. It's hard not to root for him because of that connection. At the same time, I completely understand why he's such a polarizing figure. Ever since we launched Performers, I've been interested in covering one of his books, but it's also crucial to set the right tone for this episode. So we're about to dive into Lance Armstrong's complex legacy, a figure who embodies both tremendous athletic feats and serious ethical failings. He won 7 Tour de France titles, but as we all know, those victories were underpinned by a well-planned doping scheme. His actions didn't just break the rules, they also involved aggressive denials, legal battles, and attempts to discredit anyone who spoke out against him. As we explore Lance's life, this episode for me isn't about passing moral judgment on him. Instead, we'll hold space for 2 conflicting truths. Lance Armstrong was an extraordinary athlete who accomplished incredible things both on his bike and through his work with Livestrong. Yet he also engaged in systematic cheating to achieve those results. This tension between his achievements and deception makes his story so compelling, but also difficult to grasp. Our mission on Performers is to extract lessons from history's greatest performers, and Lance's story is no exception. Now, this book takes us up to his first Tour de France victory in 1999, and it was actually published in the year 2000, so it's safe to say that a lot happened since then. But I think it gives us an amazing glimpse into his upbringing, his entry into the sport, and then, of course, his mindset as he battled stage 4 cancer. So, let's unravel the paradox of Lance Armstrong.
He certainly is a paradox. What about his awards and his accomplishments? Have you got a long list for me this week?
Well, Greg, given everything I've just said in the framing of it, I'm not going to go into a list of all his awards and accomplishments because that may fall on deaf ears with some of the listeners. But there's 2 things I want to highlight. He is the only person to win the Tour de France 7 times, and he won it on consecutive occasions between 1999 and 2005. And the second thing I want to point out, the Lance Armstrong Foundation that he founded has raised over $500 million for cancer patients and survivors. So with that framing, let's jump into his background. The main thing you need to know about my childhood is that I never had a real father, but I never sat around wishing for one either. My mother was 17 when she had me, and from day one, everyone told her we wouldn't amount to anything. But she believed differently, and she raised me with an unbending rule: make every obstacle an opportunity. And that's what we did. My mother was alone. Her parents were divorced, and at the time her father, Paul Mooneyham, my grandfather, was a heavy drinking Vietnam vet who worked in the post office and lived in a mobile home. Her mother, Elizabeth, struggled to support 3 kids. Nobody in the family had much help to give my mother, but they tried. We lived in a dreary 1-bedroom apartment in Oak Cliff, a suburb of Dallas, where my mother worked part-time and finished school. Eventually, my mother got a job as a secretary for $12,000 a year, which allowed us to move into a nicer apartment north of Dallas, in a suburb called Richardson. She later got a job at the telecommunications company Ericsson, and she worked her way up the ladder. She's no longer a secretary, she's an account manager, and what's more, she got her real estate license on the side. That right there tells you everything you need to know about her. She's sharp as a tack, and she'll outwork anybody. Greg, there wasn't a lot of money to go around, but his mum is Lance's rock throughout his journey, as we'll hear. And the line that really stood out to me was, make every obstacle an opportunity. I like to use such maxims and have throughout performers. Bigger picture, what do you think the power of maxims such as this are?
You certainly do like to use them, and Alistair Cook in the last episode said he didn't like them so much, but I'm quite a fan too. They're powerful because what they really do is condense quite complex philosophical thoughts or philosophies into short, memorable phrases that are usually pretty easy to recall and easy to remember, particularly in moments of challenge or uncertainty. So the simplicity that comes along with them allows them to cut through maybe the mental clutter and provide that clarity in the moment and act as a mental shortcut to guide the actions and the decisions that we have to make in those moments. And when we internalize these maxims, they really do become part of our mental framework, shaping it, not just how we respond in those critical moments, but also how we view the world and really our place in it.
So, a little bit about Lance. Lance got his last name from his stepfather, Terry, who he didn't actually particularly like, as you'll hear. There was one thing my mother gave me that I didn't particularly want: a stepfather. When I was 3, my mother remarried a guy called Terry Armstrong. Terry had a bad temper and he used to whip me for silly things, kid things like being messy. The paddle was his preferred method of discipline. If I came home late, out would come the paddle. Whack. If I started off, I got the paddle. Whack. It didn't hurt just physically, but emotionally, so I didn't like Terry Armstrong. So around 7 was Lance's first introduction into cycling. He got his first real bike, a Swing Mag Scrambler, which was an ugly brown one with yellow wheels apparently. But for Lance, it wasn't just a bike, it was really his first taste of liberation. But back then, I was just a kid with about 4 chips on his shoulder, thinking, maybe if I ride my bike on this road long enough, it will take me out of here. So a little bit about where he lives, Greg. He lives in Piano, Texas. And if you weren't a football player, you didn't exist. If you weren't in the upper middle class, you might as well not exist either. But I had no coordination. When it came to anything that involved moving from side to side or hand-eye coordination, when it came to anything involving a ball, in fact, I was no good. I was determined to find something I could succeed at. When I was in 5th grade, my elementary school held a distance running race. I told my mother the night before the race, I'm going to be champ. She just looked at me, and then she went into her things and dug out a 1972 silver dollar. This is a good luck coin, she said. Now remember, all you have to do is beat that clock. And I won the race. Greg, Lance's first bike kind of for him symbolizes this first sense of freedom and independence, marking the beginning of this drive to succeed in the world. But it didn't seem to have a place for him. His childhood hardships really fueled a competitive spirit, but also put a massive chip on his shoulder.
I believe so. And that independence and that freedom, I think everyone experiences that with their first bike. Not everyone goes on to win 7 Tour de France's, but I think everyone knows what that feeling's like and can probably relate to it. But everything I've ever really seen of Lance speaks to his drive, his really high intensity, that underdog, chip on shoulder mentality. And he always seemed to have a point to prove. I don't necessarily know to whom, but it always felt like a me against the world mentality. And I think that really helped him narrow his focus towards what he wanted to achieve, certainly in the moment, but perhaps without him being consciously aware of what his future goals would be, that narrow focus of attention to get somewhere in the future.
And it was definitely him and his mom against the world, and I think that was deeply ingrained from his childhood. So he joined the local swim club partly to fit in with other kids, and though he struggled at first, he was placed with the 7-year-olds when he was a lot older. He felt pretty embarrassed by this, but within a year he ranked fourth in the state of Texas for the 1500-meter freestyle. The training was intense, and he was up at 5:30 in the morning. He also did afternoon sessions, and he did cycling. So as he got older, he began riding his bike 10 miles to practice, then balancing his training with a 20-mile bike ride. So his mother supported it, knowing that he needed an outlet for his energy. So he's just one of those kids. He threw everything into his swimming and then his biking from a very early age. And then at 13, he sees a flyer about triathlon. Didn't really know much about triathlon, but here's a little bit about it. He says, "I won, and I won by a lot, without even training for it. Not long afterwards, there was another triathlon in Houston. I won that too. When I came back from Houston, I was full of self-confidence. I was a top junior at swimming, but I had never been the absolute best at it. I was better at triathlons than any kid in piano, and any kid in the whole state for that matter. I liked that feeling. What makes a great endurance athlete is the ability to absorb potential embarrassment and to suffer without complaint. I was discovering that it was a matter of gritting my teeth, not caring how it looked, and outlasting everyone else, and I won. It didn't seem to matter what the sport was. In a straight-ahead, long-distance race, I could beat anybody. If it was a sufferfest, I was good at it." So, Greg, as we saw in episode 9 with Chrissy Wellington, the undefeated Ironman triathlete, that ability to endure pain, discomfort, and potential embarrassment without complaint is really a hallmark of great endurance athletes. But it's not just about physical strength. It's about mental toughness, the willingness to push through when others might give up. Lance discovered that suffering was his edge, as he says, allowing him to outlast his competition. And this is a theme that lasts throughout the book. Now, Greg, a tough question. How much of this can you teach? It seems that some people are just better able to handle pain and suffering.
That is a tough question. And I think that we'd see in the research around pain that people have varying thresholds for pain and discomfort. And, sometimes it can be rooted in the physiological processes that are going on, but also the psychological processes. So you mentioned Chrissy Wellington there, and obviously Lance Armstrong. They sort of seem naturally wired to tolerate this higher level of pain and suffering, but that doesn't mean that it's entirely innate. The difference often lies in how people interpret that pain. So it's really just a data point. It's information that's coming in. And athletes who see suffering as a pathway to success rather than perhaps as a signal to stop are better equipped to push through it. So things like cognitive reframing, mindfulness, visualization, all things that we've talked about in previous episodes can help athletes to manage pain more effectively. However, some people, they might just give up because their threshold for pain is lower, or they mentally associate discomfort with failure, which becomes a limiting factor. And sometimes people can maybe confuse pain with injury. So while some aspects of pain tolerance are likely innate, the mental side of it and learning to embrace and endure that suffering through the development of skills and coping strategies, that can absolutely be taught and can be strengthened with repetition, just like any other skill. The question is how much someone is willing to endure for the sake of their goals. And that really boils down to a personal choice that separates good athletes from the great ones. I suppose it's called endurance for a reason.
Yeah, and that's a great breakdown. I love that, how much someone's willing to endure for the sake of their goals. And we'll see from Lance that he was willing to endure a lot. Well, when his mother decided to file for divorce from Terry Armstrong, that was great for Lance. He was very relieved and joyful. She asked him not to cause any trouble during the transition. And after the breakup, him and his mom grew even closer, and they seemed to be more at ease, and there was less pressure of an unhappy marriage. And she now really faced challenges of being single mother once again. However, Lance started to earn his own money. And he says, "When I was 15, I entered the 1987 President's Triathlon in Lake Vernon against a field of experienced older athletes. I finished 32nd, shocking the other competitors and spectators who couldn't believe a 15-year-old had held up over the course. The next year, I finished 5th. Triathlons paid good money. All of a sudden, I had a wallet full of first-place checks, and I started entering triathlons wherever I could find them. I was the National Rookie of the Year in sprint triathlons, and my mother and I realized that I had a future as an athlete. I was making about $20,000 a year, and I began keeping a Rolodex full of business contacts. I needed sponsors and supporters who were willing to front my airfare and expenses to various races. My mother told me, "Look, Lance, if you're going to get anywhere, you're going to have to do it yourself because no one is going to do it for you." So Greg, his mum continues to impress on him the importance of self-reliance, and the fact that she had Lance when she was a 17-year-old and she was a single mother isn't lost on me here. And here's a bit more about their relationship. And he says, "My mother had become my best friend and most loyal ally. She was my organizer, my motivator, a dynamo. If you can't give 110%, you won't make it," she would tell me. My mother and I became very open with each other. She trusted me totally. How do you articulate all that you feel for and owe to a parent? My mother had given me more than any teacher or father figure ever had, and she had done it over some long, hard years. When it came to never quitting, to not caring how it looked, to gritting your teeth, and to pushing to the finish, I could only hope to have the stamina and fortitude of my mother, a single woman with a young son and a small salary, and there was no reward for her at the end of the day either. No trophy or first place check. Every time she said, "Make an obstacle an opportunity, make a negative a positive," she was talking about me. So Greg, his mum obviously played such a central role in his life, as well as really cultivating his mindset. It's really maxim after maxim from his mum.
I agree. The maxims here are really useful tools for Lance to have, and when easily recited, can have a moment-to-moment impact because they're not that difficult to recall. But let's not overlook the less obvious lessons that are present here about independence and going to bat for yourself, for exploration and embracing experiences, and for simple doggedness and hard work. While there's not necessarily maxims for these from his mother, she's certainly facilitating the growth of these elements through her parenting and the kind of the style of things for him, and of course by her example.
You're absolutely right. And at the same time, obviously, he's still in school. And there's a little passage here about school and kind of the social pressure in the area. And he said, "It was total conformity and everything I was against. The things that were important to people in piano were becoming less and less important to me. School and socializing were second to me now. Developing into a world-class athlete was first." And it wasn't just his peers at the school that didn't understand him. He says, "Not even the teachers at my school seemed to understand what I was after." During the second semester of my senior year, I was invited by US Cycling Federation to go to Colorado Springs to train with the junior US national team and to travel to Moscow to my first international bike race, the 1990 Junior World Championships. Word had gotten around after my performance in New Mexico, but the administrators at Piano East objected. They had a strict policy, no unexcused absences. You'd think a trip to Moscow would be worth a few extra credits, and you'd think a school would be proud to have an Olympic prospect in their graduation rolls, but they didn't care. I went to Colorado Springs anyway, and then to Moscow. At the Junior Worlds, I had no idea what I was doing. I was all raw energy with no concept of pacing or tactics, but I led for several laps anyway before I faded, out of gas for attacking too early. Still, the US Federation officials were impressed, and the Russian coach told everybody I was the best young cyclist he'd seen in years. Greg, it's pretty wild that his school wouldn't release him for the World Championship.
Yeah, that is crazy. It really is, and it shows the importance of those people around you understanding the opportunities that are presented. In our last episode, episode 21 with Alistair Cook, we saw that opportunities can often come looking for you, but here we see Lance deciding to go and seize his opportunity without the blessing of the school, which turns out to be an incredibly shrewd move.
I don't think anybody was going to deny Lance that opportunity to go to Colorado Springs and Moscow.
It does go down as an unexcused absence, though, so I'm glad he got over that.
Yeah, I'm not sure he was too worried about his GPA. So after visiting Colorado Springs and Moscow, he was named to the US national cycling team. The new director, Chris Carmichael, contacted him, acknowledging his strength, but also noting that he needed some tactical development. Chris aimed to rejuvenate US cycling by assembling a young group of talented riders such as Bobby Ulrich and George Hincapie, and invited Lance to join them in Europe. He says, "I had no idea what I was getting into. When I left home at 18, my idea of a race was to leap on and start pedaling. I was called brash in my early years, and that tag has followed me ever since, maybe deservedly. I was very young and I had a lot to learn, and I said and did some things that maybe I shouldn't have, but I wasn't trying to be a jerk. I was just Texan. In my first big international race, I did everything my coach told me not to do. It was at the 1990 Amateur World Championships in Japan, a 115-mile road race over a tough course with long, hard climbs. So, Greg, he does well, but struggles towards the end because he didn't really listen to his coach because he'd gone out too hard early. And he says, I'd done better than any American ever before, and Chris was suggesting it wasn't good enough. In fact, in his subtle way, he was telling me that I had blown it. He kept talking. I'm serious. You can do better, he said. I'm convinced you're going to be a world champion, but there's a lot of work to do. Chris pointed out to the top riders, like Marco Pantanis and Miguel Indurain, who were all as strong or stronger than I was. What would separate me would be my tactics. I had to learn how to race, and the only place to do that was on the bike. The first year, I must have spent 200 days overseas, riding all around Europe, because the true test was on the road, where there was no hiding in a 160-mile race. So Greg, early in his pro career, we're seeing his self-reliance and a stubbornness and a chip on his shoulder. And he continues, cycling is an intricate, highly politicized sport, and it's far more of a team sport than the spectators realize, as I was discovering. It has a language all of its own, pieced together from samplings of European words and phrases, and a peculiar ethic as well. On any team, each rider has a job and is responsible for a specific part of the race. The slower riders are called domestiques, servants, because they do the less glamorous work of pulling up hills. Pulling is cycling lingo for blocking the wind for the riders and protecting their team leader through various perils of a stage race. The team leader is the principal cyclist, the rider most capable of sprinting to the finish with 150 miles in his legs. I was starting as a domestique, but I would gradually be groomed for the role of team leader. Within the peloton, there was constant negotiations between competing riders. Pull me today, and I'll pull you tomorrow.
Sounds like a fair deal.
Give an inch, make a friend.
Yeah, Taylor's all this time.
Oh boy.
Brilliant.
You don't make deals that compromise yourself or your team, of course, but you help other riders if you can, so they might return the favor.
How old are you?
I know, so I apologize there, listeners.
Yeah.
So, Greg, there's obviously a learning curve with every performance domains, and with some athletes, they just have to learn through failure, and that's what's happening to Lance here.
It is, and as he describes it, cycling's a far more complex and team-oriented sport than it appears. The dynamics within the team, with each rider playing that specific role as he outlines, that mirrors many other team sports that we're probably a little bit more familiar with. So Lance starting as a domestique and being groomed for that leadership role highlights that athletes often have to learn the intricacies of their sport through experience and build up to things, and that always includes failure. So in cycling as in life, the roles and negotiations, they're not just about physical capability, they are involving strategy, relationships, patience, just bigger picture stuff. So failure often becomes the best teacher, pushing athletes to adapt, improve, and then eventually graduating up to lead.
So he is progressing, he's slowly learning the sport, he's learning those intricacies, and in 91 he wins a prestigious race in Italy, which is a 10-day ride through northern Italy, and some of the best cyclists in the world were there, and no American had ever won it. That night, when he came down from the podium, Chris Carmichael told him something that he never forgot. He says, "You're going to win the Tour de France one day." So in 1992, I didn't actually know this, but Lance Armstrong was at the Barcelona Olympics in 92. However, he finished a disappointing 14th place in the road race. Lance still managed to catch the attention of Jim Ochowicz, one of the most influential figures in American cycling. Och, as he was known, asked me what my own ambition was. "I want to be the best rider there is," I said. "I want to go to Europe and be a pro. I don't want to just be good at it, I want to be the best." And that was good enough for Och. So Och signed Lance to a pro contract with Team Motorola. The team was mostly made up of American riders, and they packed him off to Europe. Keep in mind, this is still 7 years until he wins his first Tour de France, so he's going to go through some learning stages here. And he says, 50 riders dropped out, but I kept pedaling. I came in dead last in a field of 111 riders. I crossed the finish line almost an hour and a half behind the winner, and as I churned up the last hill, the Spanish crowd began to laugh and hiss at me. "Look at that sorry one in last place," one jeered. A few hours later, I sat at the Madrid airport slumped in a chair. I wanted to quit the entire sport. It was the most sobering race of my life. On my way to San Sebastian, I'd actually thought I had a chance of winning, and now I wondered if I could compete at all. They had laughed at me. Professional cycling was going to be a lot harder than I'd thought. The pace was faster, the terrain was tougher, the competition more fit than I ever imagined. I pulled a sheaf of unused plane tickets out of my pocket. Among them, I had a return portion to the States. I considered using it. Maybe I should just go home, I thought, and find something else to do, something I was good at. So at this moment, Greg, he has a sobering conversation with Chris Carmichael, who reminds him that he didn't quit and he actually finished the race, which really meant something because some of the other riders just quit on the course, but Lance didn't. And eventually, Chris persuades Lance to stay in Europe. And again, there's another section here about him really learning the sport of cycling, which is really heavily dominated by the Europeans. And he says, an American in cycling was comparable to a French baseball team in the World Series. I was a gatecrasher in a revered and time-honored sport, and I had little or no concept of its rules, written and unwritten, or its etiquette. Let's just say that my Texas manners didn't exactly play well on the continent. There was a big difference between the discreet jockeying of European cycling and the swaggering trash-talking American idea of competition I was reared with. Like most Americans, I grew up oblivious to cycling. It wasn't until Le Mans won victory in the '86 Tour that I really noticed the sport. There was a way things were done and attitudes that I didn't understand, and even when I did understand them, I didn't feel like I had to be part of them. In fact, I ignored them. I raced with no respect, absolutely none. I paraded, mouthed off, shoved my fist in the air. I never backed down. The journalists loved me. I was different. I made good copy. I was colourful. But I was making enemies. Give an inch, make a friend. But I wouldn't do it. Partly was my character at the time. I was insecure and defensive, not totally confident of how strong I was. I was still the kid from piano, with a chip on my shoulder, riding headlong, pedaling out of anger. I didn't think I could afford to give up inches. Greg, Lance here is acknowledging that this outward show of confidence was actually just masking his insecurities. How often do you see this with high-level performers?
Good question. I think it's something that we do see quite a lot with high level performers. This outward display of confidence, perhaps you could even call it bravado, can often be a cover up for some deep seated insecurities that they have. Andre Agassi in episode 1 certainly struggled with elements of this, and athletes like Lance and Andre sometimes they feel the need to project that strength and invincibility, especially when they're stepping into unfamiliar territory or competing against what might be well established norms. So I think this kind of defensiveness can serve as a protective shield that helps the performer mask some self-doubt or the fear of not measuring up against the competition. And it's a reminder that even people at the top of their game can struggle with imposter syndrome or just simple insecurity. And sometimes the most visible displays of confidence are actually just a way of compensating for really what's going on internally.
Yeah, I really love that. So there's a little bit more about perhaps that bravado and perhaps that confidence and how it is displayed. He says, while my aggression wasn't winning me friends in the peloton, it might become a valuable asset one day, they suspected. Arch and Chris felt that endurance events were not only about suffering pain, but about inflicting it too. And in my attacking nature, they saw the beginning of something predatory. You ever hear about how you stab someone? It's really personal, Chris once said. Well, a bike race is that kind of personal. Don't kid yourself, it's a knife fight. Arch and Chris felt that if I ever gained control of my temperament, I'd be a rider to reckon with. In the meantime, they handled me very carefully, knowing that if they started yelling at me, I would most likely turn off or rebel. They decided the lessons would sink in slowly. I roomed with two veterans, Sean Yates and Steve Bauer, who had a lot of influence over me. I fed off them, picked up a lot of knowledge just sitting around the dinner table. They helped to keep my feet on the ground. I was Mr. Energy, bouncing off the wall, saying things like, let's go there and kick butt. They would just roll their eyes. When I look back at the raw young rider I was, I felt impatience with him, but I also felt some sympathy. Underneath the tough talk and combativeness and bitching, I was afraid. I was afraid of everything. I was afraid of the train schedules, the airports and the roads. I was afraid of the phones because I didn't know how to dial them. I was afraid of the menus because I couldn't read them. Greg, we're hearing about how to direct aggressiveness, but also some insecurities there.
Yeah, I think as we've mentioned in the past, there's two sides to every quality. Sometimes we call it a shadow side. And while his aggression can be problematic at times with his opponents and even with his teammates, when he's got the ability to channel it correctly, it can be an amazing asset for him. He just has to learn how to actually channel it. We've talked in the past about how important it is to really know the person that you're working with to get the best out of them. So for the people around him, and his coaches to have the foresight to know yelling won't achieve their desired outcome. It's a very important thing here.
And jumping ahead, in 1993, he wins his first Tour de France stage win at the age of 21, and he was the youngest man ever to win one. But he has a reflection here, and he says, "But to show you just how experienced you have to be to compete on tour, I had to pull out the race a couple of days later, incapable of continuing. I abandoned after the 12th stage in 97th place and shivering. The Alps got me. They were too long and too cold," I told reporters afterwards. "I fell so far behind that when I got to the finish line, the team car had already left for the hotel. I had to walk back to our rooms, pushing my bike up a gravel trail. As if this stage wasn't enough, we had to climb this thing," I told the press. "I wasn't physically mature enough yet to ride the arduous mountain stages. I still struggled with impatience at times. I would ride smart for a while and then backslide. I just couldn't seem to get it through my head that in order to win, I had to ride more slowly at first. It took some time to reconcile myself to the notion that being patient was different from being weak, and that racing strategically didn't mean giving less than all I had." Greg, any thoughts on this idea of patience in high performance sports?
Do I? I've got a belter here for you, Duncan. So patience is like a gift card. We're not always sure how much is on it, but you can always give it a try.
I love that one.
So I think, patience is crucial, but it's often an overlooked component in high performance environments, particularly those that are measured by time, right? And especially for athletes like Lance, who are naturally aggressive and driven and want to really get on the front foot with things. So early in his career, he struggled with the idea that the patience didn't equate to weakness, but was actually a strategic tool that he could employ. In endurance events like the Tour de France, though, pacing yourself and knowing when to hold back, that's just as important as pushing really, really hard when it matters the most. So patience allows for that long-term success, and particularly in cycling, preserves energy for those critical moments when they do come up. It's really about playing the long game, and that can sometimes be hard for high achievers who are wired and conditioned to always give 100% at all times. His mother talked about making sure that he gives 110%. So he's sometimes fighting against his own nature here. But being able to wait and strike at the right moment, I think that's the key to success in so many different sports. And just like anything that we've talked about so far, it's a skill that he has to learn.
And there's one for you listeners. Patience is like a gift card. Not always sure how much is on it, but you can always give it a try. Another belter from Greg. So Lance goes to the World Championships in Oslo, and no 21-year-old had ever won it before. And if anybody knows anything about cycling, they'll have heard the name Miguel Indurain, who had just won his third Tour de France, so was obviously the clear favourite to win the World Championships. But Lance finally listens to his coaches and remains patient, attacks at the right time, and actually wins the World Championship. But he still has a lot of learning to do, and he says, "Although I was world champion, I still had plenty of learning to do, and the next 3 years were a process of testing and refinement. I had other successes, but life from now on would be a matter of incremental improvements, of seeking the tiniest margin that might separate me from the other elite riders. There was a science to winning. The spectator rarely sees the technical side of cycling, but behind the glorious rainbow blur of the peloton is the more boring reality that road racing is a carefully calibrated thing, and often a race is won by a mere fraction of acceleration that was generated in a performance lab or a wind tunnel or a velodrome long before the race ever started. Cyclists are computer slaves. We hover over precise calculations of cadence, efficiency, force and wattage. I was constantly sitting on a stationary bike with electrodes all over my body, looking for different positions on the bike that might gain me mere seconds, or a piece of equipment that might be a bit more aerodynamic." Greg, great performers are great problem solvers, and he's constantly trying to look for possible solutions. Do you think this constant drive to learn and adapt, even when you're at the top, he's a world champion here, is this a trait that defines the greatest performers?
I think it is, and the constant drive to learn and adapt, that's a hallmark of the greatest athletes. What separates the elite from the rest is their refusal to become complacent, most importantly, when they're already at the top. And this is a real understanding that they have that the margins for victory at this level are razor thin, and they're constantly searching for ways to improve, whether that's through technology, through training methods, or heaven forbid, some mental strategies and a little bit of mental training. So in Lance's case, I think his insecurities that he brings along with him, they likely play a big role in this relentless pursuit of perfection. And we've talked about this. Insecurity can be a powerful motivator. It creates that fear of losing ground or being caught or even surpassed. And I think that drives athletes like Lance to put in the extra work that they need to in order to stay ahead. So while confidence fuels that belief in winning, I think insecurity ensures that the greatest never really stop refining their game and look for that competitive or performance advantage. So I think it's this balance between the two things, that confidence and insecurity, that really leads to a sustained level of success at the highest levels.
And his drive to get better is also complemented by a meeting with a legendary rider, Eddie Merckx, and he says, at about the same time, I met legendary Belgian rider Eddie Merckx, the 5-time winner of the Tour de France and one of the most ferociously attacking riders who ever lived. I had heard all the stories about Merckx, what a brave, hard-charging rider he was, and I thought that was the kind of rider I wanted to be. I didn't just want to win. I wanted to win a certain way. We became friends. Eddie told me that I could win the Tour de France someday, but that I needed to lose weight. I was built like a linebacker with a thick neck and slabs of muscles on my chest, remnants of my career as a swimmer and a triathlete. Eddie explained that it was hard to haul all that weight up and down mountains over 3 weeks. I was still racing partly on raw power. To win the Tour de France, I would have to find a way to lose weight without losing strength. So I quit eating pastries and I laid off Tex-Mex, and I understood that I would have to find a new kind of strength, that inner strength called self-discipline. So, Greg, despite his arrogance, Lance is prepared to listen to his coaches and peers, and of course legends like Eddie Merckx.
I would have disregarded Eddie Merckx's recommendations here because I'm not getting away from pastry. That's going to be the limiting factor for me not winning the Tour. But I think you're right. His willingness to take advice and make changes, even from, as I've talked about, that position of success, and I think that really reflects his underlying drive for that continuous improvement that we've mentioned. When it comes to elite performance, body type really is crucial, and the demands of the performance domain, they really dictate the ideal tool or the ideal body type best suited to meet these challenges.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And by 1995, Lance has yet to complete an entire Tour de France because he's really known as a single-day racer, and he's really, as we've mentioned, fueled by adrenaline and aggression. He could endure extreme pain and fiercely compete, but the entire tour was you needed a different approach, one of patience and strategy, and really about conserving energy for over the long haul. And he said, I had learned what it means to ride the Tour de France. It's not about the bike. It's a metaphor for life. Not only the longest race in the world, but also the most exalting and heartbreaking and potentially tragic. It poses every conceivable element to the rider and more: cold, heat, mountains, plains, ruts, flat tires, high winds, unspeakable bad luck, unthinkable beauty, yawning senselessness, and above all, deep self-questioning. The Tour is not just a bike race, not at all. It is a test. It tests you physically, it tests you mentally, and even tests you morally. I understood that now. There were no shortcuts, I realized. It took years of racing to build up the mind, the body, and character until a rider had logged hundreds of races and thousands of miles on the roads. I wouldn't be able to win a Tour de France until I had enough iron in my legs and lungs and brain and heart. There's no shortcuts. When the tide goes out, you see who's swimming naked, as we've mentioned before, Greg. And the Tour will expose you in really painful ways unless you're fully prepared with every ounce of your being, it sounds like.
There are no shortcuts to success. It is about that consistent monotony, that discipline, that desire to keep going when things are particularly hard, and that's how you build up the skill set and, as he says here, building up that iron.
So he's just building up that iron. After the Tour de France, just as his career was really starting to take shape, he says, I thought I knew what fear was until I heard the words, "You have cancer." Real fear came with an unmistakable sensation. It was as though all my blood started flowing in the wrong direction. My previous fears, fear of not being liked, fear of being laughed at, fear of losing my money. Suddenly it all seemed like small issues. Everything now stacked up differently. The anxieties of life, a flat tire, losing my career, a traffic jam, were reprioritized into need versus want. Real problem as opposed to minor scare. A bumpy plane ride was just a bumpy plane ride. It wasn't cancer. So Greg, we're talking about a complete shift in perspective here.
These experiences really do force a reevaluation of what truly matters, and stripping away any superficial worries and focusing on survival and health and things that really count. Lance's experience illustrates how extreme adversity can lead to a deeper understanding of fear, where priorities shift and life's smaller problems can sort of drift off and fade into the background. It's a really humbling reminder of how our perspective can radically change when confronted with life's more serious challenges.
And Lance admits in the books that he should have recognized that something was wrong, but he also acknowledges that as a cyclist, denial is part of the sport. Athletes, especially endurance athletes, they experience aches and pains, but they just keep going, enduring long hours on the bike in harsh conditions, as we heard. And he just says everything hurts. But when his right testicle became swollen in 1999, he kind of brushed it off, assuming like it was just something from his cycling. Since he was actually performing really well, he actually saw no reason to stop or address it. And as we know, common sense is the least common commodity. And this is a saying that probably applies to endurance athletes more than anyone. And there's a bit of a self-reflection here after his diagnosis. And he says, I drifted through the streets in first gear without even the energy to press the gas pedal. As I puttered along, I questioned everything, my world, my profession, myself. I had left the house an indestructible 25-year-old, bulletproof. Cancer would change everything for me, I realized. It wouldn't just derail my career, it would deprive me of my entire definition of who I was. I had started with nothing. My mother was a secretary in Piano, Texas, but on my bike I had become something. When other kids were swimming at a local country club, I was biking for miles after school because it was my chance. There were gallons of sweat all over every trophy and dollar I had ever earned. And now what would I do? Who would I be if I wasn't Lance Armstrong, world-class cyclist? But as I sat in my house alone that first night, it was humbling to be so scared. More than that, it was humanizing. Greg, his entire identity is under threat here.
It is, and before I go a little bit more in depth there, probably a bit of a public service announcement. It's usually men in their 30s. Take a moment to check yourself, look at resources online, and try and catch these things before they become an issue. Going back to your question about identity, up until that moment, Lance's his entire sense of self was tied to being a world-class cyclist, built through years of his own hard work, his sacrifice and his determination. And the fear of losing not just his career, but as you say, his very identity as an athlete, that's got to be deeply unsettling for him. For someone who's defined himself through physical strength and endurance, that sudden just wave of vulnerability brought on by illness is both humbling and humanizing. And it highlights how difficult it can be to question who you are when the foundation of your identity is under threat like this. This moment of self-reflection really reveals the internal struggle of grappling with who you are beyond what you do for a living.
So we're going to talk at length about his cancer and his diagnosis because it really does frame his mindset for the rest of his career. And things moved incredibly quickly. He had 3 different types of cancer in stage 3, which was spreading, so every day counted. And he had to start chemo immediately after his diagnosis. And he says, the physical pain of cancer didn't bother me so much because I was used to it. In fact, if I didn't suffer, I feel cheated. The more I thought about it, the more cancer began to seem like a race to me. Only the destination had changed. They shared grueling physical aspects as well as the dependence on time and a progress report every interval with checkpoints and a slavish reliance on numbers and blood tests. The only difference was that I had to focus better and harder than I ever had on the bike. With this illness, I couldn't afford impatience or a lapse of concentration. I had to think about living, just making it through every single moment. The idea was oddly restorative. Winning my life back would be my greatest victory.
Duncan, we're hearing how Lance is applying that really elite performer mentality to a vastly different challenge here, the cancer as opposed to the bike performance. Just as he approached cycling with a focus on his endurance, on time and pushing through pain, he's now framing his cancer battle essentially as another race, one with obviously even higher stakes. The grueling physical aspects and the reliance on progress markers, this is something that's really familiar to him, But this fight requires even more focus and something that he's not particularly good at, even more patience. He can't afford lapses in concentration or the luxury of impatience. What's really striking is how he's using the mindset that made him a champion, that embracing suffering and relying on his discipline to confront the ultimate challenge, which is essentially fighting for his life.
Yeah, I love that, how he's taking his athletic mindset into a very and vastly different field, and it's going to serve him well, obviously. So a little bit of backstory here. He had simultaneously, at that almost precise moment he's diagnosed with cancer, he had changed employers and teams from Motorola to a new French team, Conflexities, and the health insurance with Motorola had expired, and although his contract with the French team had taken effect, cancer was obviously a pre-existing medical condition for which he was not covered under their treatment plan. And he says, I had cancer and I had no health insurance. A lot of terrible realizations hit me one after another in those first few days, and this was only a material matter. Still, it was potentially ruinous. I looked around my house and started thinking about what to sell. I was wiped out financially, I assumed. I had just gone from making $2 million a year to nothing. I had some disability insurance, but that was about it. I had no income because the companies that sponsor me or pay me would cut me off surely, since I couldn't raise. The Porsche I had so treasured now seemed like an item of pure decadent self-indulgence. I would need every penny to pay medical bills. I started planning a fire sale. I'd get rid of the Porsche and some art and a few other toys. So psychologically, Greg, this is an incredibly difficult period. Not only, obviously, he's battling cancer, but he doesn't financially have the means to, pay for the treatment. So we're going to hear a little bit more here, how quickly it unfolded. He said, I was diagnosed on Wednesday, had surgery on Thursday, was released Friday, banked sperm on Saturday, had a press conference announcing to the world that I had testicular cancer on Monday morning, started chemo on Monday afternoon. Now it was Thursday, and it was in my brain. This opponent was turning out to be much tougher than I thought. I couldn't seem to get any good news. It's in your lungs, it's stage 3, you have no insurance, now it's in your brain. So obviously this thing's moving incredibly quickly, and the prognosis, or the diagnosis I should say, really isn't good at all. And as you can imagine, it takes a lot of self-reflection during this period. And he says, what are my chances? It was a question I would repeat over and over. But it was irrelevant, wasn't it? Hope, that is the only antidote to fear. Why me? Why anybody? I was no more or less valuable than a man sitting next to me in the chemo center. It was not a question of worthiness. What is stronger, fear or hope? It's an interesting question, and perhaps even an important one. Initially, I was very fearful and without much hope, but as I sat there and absorbed the full extent of my illness, I refused to let fear completely blot out my optimism. Something told me that fear should never fully rule the heart, and I decided not to be afraid.
Duncan, that's a really powerful paragraph there. And I think the reflection really brings to light the immense power of hope, particularly in the face of overwhelming fear, which no doubt Lance was experiencing here. And he really grapples with the question of why me, but realizes that trying to assign worth or probabilities to someone's survival strips them of the one thing that they need the most, and that is hope. So research in psychology supports this and shows that hope is a powerful psychological resource that can actually enhance resilience, improve well-being, and even affect health outcomes. So there are some studies that suggest that patients who maintain a sense of hope despite difficult medical odds often experience better emotional health and sometimes even improved recovery.
And I can't help but think some of that athlete mentality and that hope and optimism has carried over here. And he says, I wanted to live, but whether I would or not was a mystery. And in the midst of confronting that fact, even at that moment, I was beginning to sense that to stare into the heart of such a fearful mystery wasn't a bad thing. To be afraid is a priceless education. Once you've been scared, you know more about your frailty than most people. And I think that changes a man. I was brought low, and there was nothing to take refuge in but the philosophical. This disease would force me to ask more of myself as a person than I ever had before, and to seek out a different ethic. So cancer is really having a profound impact on his outlook on life. And this section follows on. He goes to a few leading cancer centers, one in Houston and then in Indianapolis, and eventually settles on the Indiana Medical Center for treatment, mainly because they actually believe that they could treat his cancer without using one of the powerful chemo drugs that would affect his lungs and ultimately would take him out of cycling for life in his career. So Lance opted to go to Indiana. And he says, the night before brain surgery, I thought about death. I searched out my larger values and I asked myself, if I was going to die, did I want to do it fighting and clawing or in a peaceful surrender? What sort of character did I hope to show? Was I content with myself and what I had done with my life so far? I decided I was essentially a good person, although I could have been better. But at the same time, I understood that cancer didn't care.
Duncan, this hit me as it's actually a rather stoic way of looking at things for Lance here. And the Stoics believed in the finality of death and that the content of life is actually more important than its length. So they believed that people should reflect on the morality, but not to evoke fear or to evoke a sense of sadness, but rather to live more fully and perhaps a little bit more authentically as well. So this is a concept that's known as memento mori, which is a Latin phrase which means remember you must die. And it's not necessarily a coping mechanism, but a way of kind of taking stock and having an understanding about who you are and what are the good things that you've done. It seems like he's got quite a stoic approach here. I don't know. That was just something that stood out to me as you were reading through there.
No, I appreciate that. And at this time, he's really in a bad place, but he gets some very good news. And he says, Nike didn't desert me. As I got sicker, it meant everything. What's more, my other sponsors responded the same way. One by one, I heard the same sentiments from Giro, Oakley, Milton Bradley. Bill picked up the phone and called Mike Parnell, the CEO of Oakley. He explained what had happened. Hesitantly, Bill asked Mike if they could help me. Mike said that he could arrange for me to be covered. Suddenly, I had a reason for optimism, but then the healthcare provider balked. I had a pre-existing condition, and therefore they were not obliged to cover my cancer treatments. Mike Parnell picked up the phone and called the provider. He informed them that if they did not cover my medical treatments, his entire firm would take its business elsewhere. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to adequately convey what it meant to me. And I'll be an Oakley, Nike, and Giro athlete for as long as I live. They paid my contracts in full, every single one, even though each of them had the right to terminate the deal, and none of them ever so much asked me about when I would ride a bike again. Greg, this makes me kind of feel a little fuzzy inside.
Unfortunately, I wish I could say the same thing. It simply makes me angry when I think about the system of healthcare in the US and how one of the, essentially one of the top athletes that is ultimately worth millions of dollars can struggle to pay medical bills and get life-saving care. I think you're right. It's wonderful that people rallied around him, but it's a real shame and it really annoys me that they actually had to do that in the first place.
It's a good point. I hadn't actually thought about it that way. So despite Lance's sponsor sticking with him, his contract with the Conflexities team was a little bit different, and through his agent Bill, they said they'd have to renegotiate his contract because of the illness. And he says, in the end, Conflexities paid less than a third of my original 2-year contract and required an out clause for them in 1998. It felt like a vote of no confidence. It felt like they thought I was dying. I got the message Conflexities was sending. I was a dead man. The chemo left me so foggy that memory of that time is sketchy. But what I do know for sure is that at my sickest, I was starting to beat this thing. Well, anyway, a spoiler alert, he is a responder to the chemo. We're going to sum up his experience here, Greg. And he said, I had to ask myself, if I live, who is it that I intend to be? I found that I had a lot of growing to do as a man. I won't kid you. There are 2 Lance Armstrongs, pre-cancer and post. Everyone's favorite question is, how did cancer change you? The real question is, how didn't it change me? I left my house on October 2nd, 1996 as one person and came home another. I was a world-class athlete with a mansion on the riverbank, keys in a Porsche, and a self-made fortune in the bank. I was one of the top riders in the world and my career was moving along at a perfect arc of success. I returned a different person, literally. In a way, the old me did die, and I was given a second life. Even my body was different, because during chemotherapy, I lost all the muscle I had ever built up, and when I recovered, it didn't come back the same way. The truth is that cancer was the best thing that ever happened to me. I don't know why I got the illness, but it did wonders for me, and I wouldn't want to walk away from it. Why would I want to change, even for a day, the most important and shaping event in my life? People die. That truth is so disheartening that at times I can't bear to articulate it. I saw children with no eyelashes or eyebrows, their hair burnt away by chemo, who fought with the hearts of Miguel Indurain. Why should we go on, you might ask? Why don't we all just stop and lie down where we are? But there is another truth too. People live. It's an equal and opposing truth. People live, and in the most remarkable ways. When I was sick, I saw more beauty and triumph and truth in a single day than I ever did in a bike race. So Greg, this section really captures that profound transformation that Lance underwent through his battle with cancer. And I think here's this stark realization that sometimes the hardest experiences become the most defining, and they can reshape who we are at our core.
I think profound is a right word. It's a very evocative passage that you've just read there. Life-altering experiences can force people, not just high performers, but definitely high performers, to completely reevaluate their purpose and maybe push them to look beyond the narrow lens of success and titles and accomplishments that might have defined them in the past. I think for many performers, these experiences can really create a deeper connection to their craft and to their sport and to their endeavors. They maybe start to see their performance not just as a path to glory, but maybe as a vehicle for something greater, whether that's inspiring other people, giving back, philanthropy, or just demonstrating resilience in the fear of adversity. These are all really positive things.
And Greg, that's a perfect segue into this section. And he says, on December 13th, 1996, I took my last chemo treatment. It was almost time to go home. Shortly before I received the final dose, Craig Nichols came by to see me. He wanted to talk to me, quote unquote, about the obligation of the cured. Dr. Nichols had seen all kinds of cancer patients become dedicated activists against the disease, and he hoped that I would be one of them. I hope so too. I was beginning to see cancer as something that I was given for the good of others. I wanted to launch a foundation, and I asked Dr. Nichols for some suggestions about what it might accomplish. I wasn't yet clear on what the exact purpose of the organization would be. All I knew was that I felt I had a mission to serve others that I'd never had before, and I took it more seriously than anything in the world. I had a new sense of purpose, and it had nothing to do with my recognition and exploits on a bike. Some people won't understand this, but I no longer felt that it was my role in life to be a cyclist. Maybe my role was to be a cancer survivor. My strongest connections and feelings were with people who were fighting cancer and asking the same question I was: am I going to die? I wanted the foundation to manifest all of the issues I had dealt with in the past few months: coping with fear, the importance of alternative options, thorough knowledge of the disease, the patient's role in cure, and above all, the idea that cancer did not have to be a death sentence. It could be a route to a second life, an inner life, a better life. So Greg, I thought I'd take an opportunity and just talk about Livestrong here. In 1997, Lance launched the Lance Armstrong Foundation, and Livestrong, the brand, was launched by the foundation in 2003. In 2004, in partnership with Nike, they launched the iconic yellow Livestrong bracelet, which is probably one of the best pieces of marketing ever done. They sold an estimated 18 million, and to date, Livestrong has helped over 10 million cancer patients and their families and has raised over 500 million. Of course, he resigned from the foundation in 2012 due to the doping scandal, but the foundation continues to have a profound impact on cancer and the families impacted by it. So, Greg, you can get cynical and loathsome about Lance for his cheating, but there's simply no getting away from the fact that he did such tremendous good in this world and he saved countless lives. And I think we can hold both truths simultaneously, like I mentioned at the beginning. One does not have to cancel out the other.
I agree, and as comedian Neil Brennan put it, say what you will about Lance Armstrong, but he figured out a way to do drugs for charity.
Yes, exactly. I was getting emotional and you were throwing in jokes.
Got to lighten the tone a little bit.
Yeah. So at the same time, he's still feeling mounting financial pressures to get back on the bike, to get some of his contract money. He has to attend some races. However, Confedis decided instead to actually terminate his contracts, and none of the other 20 European teams would sign him. There was another fact to consider. He had a disability policy that would pay him for 5 years, but if he actually made a comeback, then he would forfeit the disability policy, which was worth 20k a month, so a significant amount of money. The only team willing to speak to him was the US Postal Service team, and they eventually settled on 215 grand a year base salary, and they built in some incentives which would be significantly less than his insurance policy. but he wants to take this gamble. So he's going to settle on the contract as opposed to actually the more lucrative way forward would be to continue on his disability. And simultaneously, he's dating Kristen Richard, who would become his first wife, and she's really a rock for him during this comeback period. So they moved to Europe in the winter of '98 in preparation for spring racing season, and he says, "Deep down, I wasn't ready. Had I understood more about survivorship, I would have recognized that my comeback attempt was bound to be fraught with psychological problems. If I had a bad day, I had the tendency to say, well, I've just been through too much. I've been through 3 surgeries, 3 months of chemo, a year of hell, and that's the reason I'm not riding well. My body is just never going to be the same." But what I really should have been saying was, hey, it's just a bad day. I was riding with buried doubts and some buried resentments too. I was making a fraction of my old salary and I had no new endorsements. I sarcastically called it an 80% cancer tax. I'd assumed the minute I got on the bike and announced my comeback, corporate America would come knocking, but they didn't. So in his first race back, he actually does well and finishes 14th, but then he quits in the middle of his next race and he's adamant that he's done and he wants to retire. He and Kristen move back to Austin, which is a huge personal upheaval, especially for her, where she's just settled into Europe. But they're back in Austin and he says, I was a bum. I played golf every day. I water skied. I drank beer and I laid on the sofa and channel surfed. I went to Chewy's for Tex-Mex and violated every rule of my training diet. I never intended to deprive myself again. I'd been given a second chance and I was determined to take advantage of it. But it wasn't fun. It wasn't light-hearted or free or happy. It was forced. The truth was I felt ashamed. I was filled with self-doubt and embarrassed by what I'd done in Paris-Nice. Son, you never quit. But I'd quit. I was behaving totally out of character and the reason was survivorship. It was a classic case of, now what? I'd had a job and a life and then I got sick and it turned my life upside down. And when I tried to go back to my life, I was disorientated. Nothing was the same and I couldn't handle it. I hated the bike, but I thought, what else am I going to do? Be a coffee boy in an office? I didn't exactly feel like a champ at much else. I didn't know what to do. So for the moment, I just wanted to escape and that's what I did. I evaded my responsibilities. I know now that surviving cancer involved more than just the convalescence of my body. My mind and soul had to convalesce too. So Lance is struggling to adapt and he has a come to Jesus conversation with Kristen because she's struggling to cope with this new lazy Lance. And she says, you need to decide something, she told me. You need to decide if you are going to retire for real and be a golf playing, beer drinking, Mexican food eating slob. If you are, that's fine. I love you and I'll marry you anyway, but I just need to know so I can get myself together and go back on the street and get a job to support your golfing. Just tell me. But if you're not going to retire, then you need to stop eating and drinking like this and being a bum, and you need to figure it out because you are deciding by not deciding. And this is so un-Lance. It is just not you. And I'm not quite sure who you are right now. I love you anyway, but you need to figure something out. Greg, we've seen with several of our performers that at one stage in their career, they've needed a kind of stern talking to. I remember Jackie Robinson in episode 12, Abby Wambach in episode 16, Bubba Watson in episode 18, and Simone Biles in episode 20. I think this demonstrates that despite their exceptional talents, these performers also need a kick up the butt sometimes.
In order to see your reflection, sometimes you have to have someone hold the mirror up for you. And it sounds like all of those people in all those previous episodes, and certainly Lance here with Kristen, has someone to hold that mirror up to him. And sometimes it's just a little bit of a nudge to get back and realign with what's important. Other times it is a more forceful recalibration that's needed to kind of shock someone back to their purpose or direction.
And there's a few others that have words with Lance, and he eventually kind of comes around to the idea of a comeback, and he's planning for the US Championships and in preparation as a training camp in Boone, North Carolina. And he says, I began to enjoy the single-mindedness of training, riding hard during the day and holing up in the cabin in the evenings. I even appreciated the awful weather. It was as if I was going back to Paris-Nice and staring the elements that had defeated me in the eye. What had cracked me in Paris were the cold, wet conditions, and now I took satisfaction in riding through them the way I'd used to. Towards the end of the camp, we decided to ride Beach Mountain. It was a strenuous 5,000-foot climb with a snow-capped summit, and it had been a crucial stage in my 2 Tour de Pont victories. That ascent triggered something in me. As I rode upwards, I reflected on my life, back to all points, my childhood, my early races, my illness, and how it changed me. Maybe it was a primitive act of climbing that made me confront the issues I'd been evading for weeks. It was time to quit stalling, I realized. Move, I told myself. If you can still move, you aren't sick. As I continued upward, I saw my life as whole. I saw the pattern and the privilege of it and the purpose of it too. It was simply this. I was meant for a long, hard climb. I approached the summit. Behind me, Chris could see the attitude of my body on the bike and that I was having a change of heart. Some weight he sensed was simply no longer there. I passed the rest of the trip in a state of near reverence for those beautiful, peaceful, soulful mountains. The rides were demanding and quiet, and I rode with the pure love of the bike until Boone began to feel like the Holy Land to me, a place I had come to on a pilgrimage. If I ever have serious problems again, I know that I'll go back to Boone and find the answer. I got my life back on those rides. Greg, Lance credits his time in Boone as really a pivotal turning point in his career.
His time training in Boone isn't just about getting stronger physically, although he's doing that. It's also about rediscovering his purpose, and the harsh conditions that once beat him, they serve as a backdrop now for his reflection and for that renewal. And in those mountains, he's really experienced a sort of an awakening and realizing that he is built for the long, hard fight, both on and off the bike. And this experience in Boone, I think, gives him some clarity and a renewed sense of purpose, and making this moment more than just about the comeback. It's perhaps his, I don't know, spiritual renewal.
You know, he takes all of that and he goes to the US Championships and he finishes fourth, which was actually a very good result for him. And he makes this commitment with Kristen and they move back to France. But this time things really feel different. He skips the Tour de France that year because he doesn't feel physically or mentally ready. And ironically, in 1998, the Tour involved a series of raids on team cars by the French police, who found truckloads of EPO and anabolic steroids. Team members and their officials were thrown in French jails and everyone was under suspicion. And the cyclists were furious at the tactics used by authorities. Of the 21 teams that began the race, only 14 teams finished, and one team was expelled and the other 6 quit in protest.
Wow.
And interestingly, he says, doping is an unfortunate fact of life in cycling, or any other endurance sport for that matter. Inevitably, some teams and riders feel like it's nuclear weapons, that they have to do it to stay competitive within the peloton. I never felt that way, and certainly after chemo, the idea of putting anything foreign in my body was especially repulsive. So hearing this from Lance is tough because we all know that he was cheating like a lot of the others. The fact he even chooses to comment on this when he could have left it out speaks to a kind of psychopathy for me.
Yeah, it definitely feels unsettling, and knowing what we now know, maybe this speaks to a deeper complexity in his character and a certain detachment and definitely denial.
Right.
So his ability to speak out against doping while simultaneously engaging in it, I think that reveals a level of manipulation and absolute peak levels of self-deception that makes the story even more difficult to reconcile.
It is difficult to reconcile, but as we said, we can hold both truths simultaneously here. There's still a lot to learn from Lance. So Greg, just to educate you, because like you say, every day is a school day, we're going to give you a little bit of a history of the Tour de France here. The bicycle was an invention of the Industrial Revolution along with the steam engine and telegraph, and the first Tour de France was held in 1903, the result of a challenge in the French sporting press. Of the 60 racers who started, only 21 finished, and the event immediately captivated the nation. An estimated 100,000 spectators lined the roads into Paris, and there was cheating right from the start. Drinks were spiked, broken bottles were thrown onto the road by the leaders to sabotage the riders chasing them. The early riders had to carry their own food and equipment. Their bikes had just 2 gears, and they used their feet as brakes. The first mountain stages were introduced in 1910 along with brakes when the peloton rode through the Alps despite the threat of attacks from wild animals. I'm not quite sure what wild animals in France there was. But
This sounds far more entertaining than the current iteration.
I know. Today, the race is a marvel of technology. The bikes are so light you can lift them over your head with one hand, and the riders are equipped with computers, heart rate monitors, and even two-way radios.
And even two-way radios, like it's a fucking miracle of science.
But the essential test of the race has not changed. Who can best survive the hardships and find the strength to keep going? So a little bit about Lance and his personality and how it's evolving with his performance. And he says, but it was funny. I wasn't as good in the one-day races anymore. I was no longer the angry and unsettling young rider I had been. My racing was still intense, but it had become subtler in style and technique, not as visibly aggressive. Something different fueled me now, psychologically, physically, and emotionally. And that something was the Tour de France. I was willing to sacrifice the entire season to prepare for the Tour. I staked everything on it. How do you think an athlete's personalities and priorities shape their performance strategy, like we're hearing here?
I think as an athlete matures, their focus often shifts from those short-term, moment-to-moment wins to long-term goals, which can completely change their approach to performance and training. So for Lance, I think his priority shifted towards the Tour de France, and his entire strategy became more focused, more disciplined, and more methodical. And I think his personality that was once fueled by aggression and anger that really served him well in those one-day races, I think that's evolved into one that's now driven by purpose and precision. That's probably going to suit him. In fact, we obviously know it suits him better for those grueling 60-day tours.
So in preparation for the Tour, they embark on a really intense training camp led by Johan Brunel. And he says, we scouted the mountain terrain of the Tour and practiced the climbs we'd be facing, riding back-to-back 7-hour days in all weather. As we went over the mountainous sections, I worked especially closely with Kevin and Tyler because they were our climbers, the guys who would have the most work to do pulling me up those gradients. While most of the riders were resting in the off-season or competing in the classics, we rode uphill in foul conditions. Johan and I had a running joke. It was January in the Pyrenees, and every day it pissed down rain. I was getting beat up, hammered by those climbs. When we were in the Alps or Pyrenees, I trained on my own. There was a purpose to everything I did. Kristen and I lived day in and day out with only two things in mind, the Tour de France and having a healthy baby. Anything else was secondary, an unnecessary distraction. But there was a sort of peace in the simplicity of our dedication. I geeked out. I tackled the problem of the Tour as if I was in math class, science class, chemistry class, and nutrition class all rolled into one. I did computer calculations that balanced my body weight and my equipment weight with the potential velocity of my bike in various stages, trying to find the equation that would get me to the finish line faster than anybody else. I kept careful computer graphs of my training rides, calibrating the distances, wattages, and thresholds. Even eating became mathematical. I measured my food intake. I kept a small scale in the kitchen, and I weighed the portions of pasta and bread. Then I calculated my wattages, my caloric intake, so I knew precisely how much to eat each day, how many calories to burn, so that the amount coming in would be less than my output and I would lose weight. Greg, another kind of side comment here, but cancer has this unexpected benefit for Lance. As he mentioned earlier, it really reshaped his body, giving him a really leaner and lighter frame. Of course, doping probably played a role here too, but previously his bulky build had really hindered his ability to climb in the mountains despite, his power. But he has lost 15 pounds, which was much more than the recommended 5 pounds that Eddie Merckx recommended to him. So he really found a new lightness on the bike, and the weight loss combined with a more balanced mindset really improved his climbing ability significantly, turning what was a weakness of his actually into a strength. And there's a bit more here. And he says, I rode and I rode and I rode, and I rode like I'd never ridden, punishing my body up and down every hill I could find. There was something like 50 good, arduous climbs around Nice, solid inclines of 10 miles or more. The trick was not to climb every once in a while, but to climb repeatedly. I would do 3 different climbs in a day over the course of a 6 or 7 hour ride. A 12-mile climb took about an hour, so that tells you what my days were like. I rode when no one else would ride, sometimes not even my teammates. I remember one day in particular, May 3rd, a raw European spring day, biting cold. I steered my bike into the Alps with Johan following me in the car. By now it was sleeting and 32 degrees. I didn't care. We stood at the roadside and I looked at the view and the weather. Johan suggested that we skip it. I said, no, let's do it. I rode for 7 straight hours alone. To win the tour, I had to be willing to ride when no one else would ride. Greg, every time you avoid discomfort, you're really reinforcing the belief that you can't handle it. And he is not avoiding any form of discomfort here.
He is not. He's definitely making that conscious choice to do so as well. And I think that relentless commitment to just simply outwork everyone, even when the conditions were brutal and others aren't willing to push that hard, it shows it's not just about physical endurance, but the mental toughness to keep going when most, if not all people would stop. So the repeated climbs, the solo rides, those 7-hour days, the refusal to skip those tough days despite the sleet and the wind and the rain, this all reflects a mindset that he knew that winning the tour would require doing simply what other people wouldn't do. And it's about going beyond the comfort zone, embracing suffering, and really developing that sharp edge that's as mental as it is physical. And that's where champions are made.
Yeah, that's a really great reflection. And that takes us perfectly into the 1999 Tour de France. And the tour began with the prologue, which is an 8-kilometer time trial. The course demanded real precision and an all-out effort, and it starts with a 5-kilometer sprint, which was then followed by a grueling 700-meter climb, ending with a flat sprint to the finish. Johan Brunel meticulously planned the strategy, really calculating wattages and split times, even setting a heart rate target of 190 for the first sprint. Armstrong finished in 8 minutes and 2 seconds, becoming the leader of the Tour de France and wearing the yellow jersey for the first time. And this is a little reflection on that success. He says, as much as I had prepared for the tour, the moment was one thing I had left out. I hadn't prepared for the sensation of pulling on that jersey, of feeling that fabric slide over my back. There was a second supremely sweet moment of victory. As I made my way through the finish area, I passed the Complexities team. Assorted members of the organization stood around, the man who had left me for dead in the hospital room. That was for you, I said, as I moved past them. I was the first American riding for an American team on an American bike ever to lead the Tour de France. That morning, I looked at the date. It was July 4th. Suddenly, I got nervous. The yellow jersey was a responsibility. Now, instead of being the attacker, I would be the rider under attack, and I had never been in the position of defending the jersey before. So the Tour's opening stages are really meant for the sprinters, and they're really filled with a lot of tense positioning and frequent crashes. Armstrong's teammates really protect him through all these early stages and make sure that he does not get into any serious crashes, as there's nearly 200 riders and they all are jostling for position. Their goal is really in this first few stages is to stay safe but near the front and ultimately conserving energy for kind of crucial time trials. And even if it meant giving up the yellow jersey for a while, they were prepared to do it. So it was really that long patient game, which Lance hadn't been used to before, but they had a different mindset. And he says, we entered the mountains. From now on, everything would be uphill, including the finish lines. The first alpine stage was a ride of 132.7 kilometers into the shallow-studded town of Sestriere, which is on the French-Italian border. And I knew that the peloton was thinking that I would fold. They didn't respect the yellow jersey on my back. I had never been a renowned climber, and now we're about to embark on the most grueling and storied stages of the race, through peaks that made riders crack like walnuts. I was sure to come under heavy attack from my adversaries, but what they didn't know was how specifically and hard I had trained for this part of the race. It was time to show them. It would be a tactical ride as much as a physical one, and I would rely heavily on my fellow climbers Kevin Livingston and Tyler Hamilton. The mountains would be the true test, not just of Lance's strength, but also for everything that he's trained for. And now it's time for him to prove that he belonged at the front of the pack. And I'll just do this quick section, then I'd love your reflection, Greg. And he says, now came our third mountain ascent in the space of 6 hours, into freezing rains and mist. We would ride into a rain shower, then out the other side. At the peak, it was so cold that the rain froze to my shirt. At the descent, it hailed. Now, I was separated from the rest of the team and the attacks kept coming, as if the other riders thought I was going to crack at any moment. It made me angry. The weaker riders fell away, unable to keep up. I found myself out in front among the top climbers in the world, working alone. I intended to make them suffer until they couldn't breathe. When you open a gap, and when your competitors don't respond, it tells you something. they're hurting. And when they're hurting, that's when you take them. Greg, this is just psychological warfare here.
This is classical psychological warfare. And he's obviously not just competing physically, of course he is, but he's using the grueling conditions and the relentless pace to basically break his competitors mentally. And by pushing himself to stay out in front and forcing the others to continue to chase, he's without a doubt creating doubt and fatigue in their minds, not just in their legs. So the moment that he's really seen them falter and giving that knowledge that they're vulnerable, that's when he's chosen to attack. It's about using every element, the weather, the fatigue, and the mental pressure to weaken your opponents even before they realize it, and then really exploiting those moments.
So, in the Alps, Armstrong's newfound climbing ability sparks suspicion in the French press, who are still reeling from the previous summer's doping scandal. Stories in L'Equipe and Le Monde hinted that his comeback was too miraculous, even suggesting chemotherapy had somehow enhanced his performance. Armstrong, of course, dismissed the accusations, saying that his success at Setriere came from hard work and preparation, not drugs. Despite his efforts, the press didn't relent, leading him to take a brief break from all media interactions. And then he says, the media had become as much of an obstacle as the terrain itself. That day, the International Cycling Union released all of my drug tests, which were, in fact, clean. What's more, I had received a wonderful vote of confidence from the race organizer, Jean-Marie Leblanc. Armstrong beating his illness is a sign that the Tour can beat its own illness, he said. So, Greg, I'm not saying Jean-Marie Leblanc covered up his drugs test, although there were certainly accusations as such. And there's a classic quote by Charlie Munger, never ever think about something else when you should be thinking about the power of incentives. The Lance Armstrong story was bringing in millions of new fans to the sport, which equals millions of dollars. And there's one other thing, I heard recently Dana White, the president of the UFC, characterize UFC as we sell holy shit moments. I love that. We sell holy shit moments. And I just feel like the Tour was getting their own holy shit moment. Lance and his story was just capturing the imagination of the world at the time.
Absolutely. It's the capitalism. This is basically free advertising for the Tour and getting it back on track. So the most French man of all time, Jean-Marie Leblanc, I can see why he's piggybacking on this. But I actually really also love that by Dana White. Dana White and LeBlanc, are these the same people? Are these the same people?
Yeah, possibly. So he outperforms all expectations in the mountains and leads the Tour going into the final two stages. And last few paragraphs to really sum up the Tour, and he says, there's a real threat that could still prevent me from winning the Tour, a crash. I face one last obstacle, an individual time trial over 35.4 miles. In a time trial, very, very bad things could happen. I could fall and break a collarbone or a leg. Bill Stapleton came to see me in the hotel the night before the stage. Lance, I'm not a coach, but I think that you should take it easy here, he said. You've got a lot to lose. Let's just get through it. Don't do anything stupid. The smart play was to avoid any mistakes. Don't fall, don't hurt yourself, and don't lose 10 minutes because of a crash. I didn't care. Bill, who the fuck do you think you're talking to? I said. What? I'm going to kick ass tomorrow. I'm giving it everything. I'm going to put my signature on this Tour. Okay, Bill said with resignation. Only 3 riders had ever swept all the time trials in the Tour, and they happened to be the 3 greatest ever. Bernard Hinault, Eddie Merckx, and Miguel Indurain. I wanted to be among them. I wanted to prove I was the strongest man in the race. I raced along a highway in the final sprint. I bared my teeth, counting, driving. I crossed the line and checked the time. 1 hour, 8 minutes, 17 seconds. I won by 9 seconds. I cruised into the gated area, braked, and fell off the bike, bent over double. I had won the stage, and I had won the Tour de France. I was now assured of it. My closest competitor was Zoul, who trailed the overall standings by 7 minutes and 37 seconds, an impossible margin to make up on the final stage in Paris.
Duncan, Lance's psychology in this moment is quite striking. Rather than really playing it safe with his huge lead, his refusal to coast and to take Bill's advice shows a mentality rooted in, I guess, dominance and the desire to prove himself at every opportunity. For him, it seems like simply winning wasn't enough. He really needed to leave no doubt that he was the strongest. I love that line. He really wanted to put his signature on the tour. And I think this mindset of a mix of fearlessness and probably ego as well, where taking unnecessary risks to secure victory really does become part of his identity, and that ruthlessness that he has. It's a statement that winning on the safest path just wouldn't satisfy him. It wouldn't scratch that itch, as it were. He wanted to really stamp his authority on that race, even if it meant gambling and having potential disaster rear its head. I think his need to prove superiority overcomes any rational caution in this situation.
If you asked me to choose between winning the Tour de France and cancer, I would choose cancer. Odd as it sounds, I would rather have the title of cancer survivor than winner of the Tour because of what it has done for me as a human being, a man, a husband, a son, and a father. In those first days after crossing the finish line in Paris, I was swept up in a wave of attention, and as I struggled to keep things in perspective, I asked myself why my victory had such a profound effect on people. Maybe it's because the illness is universal. We've all been sick, no one is immune, and so my winning the Tour was a symbolic act, proof that you can not only survive cancer, but thrive after it. Maybe, as my friend Phil Knight says, I am hope. And that is where we'll leave it today. But Greg, what are your top 10 life lessons from It's Not About the Bike by Lance Armstrong?
My top 10 life lessons from It's Not About the Bike by Lance Armstrong. Number 1, overcoming adversity. Hardship can fuel your drive to succeed, transforming obstacles into motivation. As his mother said, make every obstacle an opportunity. Number 2, the power of mental toughness. Success is as much about mental resilience as physical strength. He says, what makes a great endurance athlete is the ability to absorb potential embarrassment and to suffer without complaint. Number 3, self-reliance. Depend on yourself, but recognize when it's okay to ask for help. Again, as his mother said, look, Lance, if you're going to get anywhere, you're going to have to do it yourself. Number 4, redefining fear. True fear reshapes your understanding of life's challenges, shifting your perspective on what truly matters. He says, my previous fears suddenly seemed like small cowardices. Of course, this is about his cancer diagnosis. Number 5, the importance of purpose. A strong sense of purpose can guide you through the hardest of battles. He says, cancer did wonders for me, and I wouldn't want to walk away from it. Number 6, adaptability. Success requires adapting to new realities, both physically and mentally. He said, my body is different. I had a lot of growing up to do as a man. Number 7, dedication and hard work. Relentless commitment to outworking others is key to achieving greatness. He says, to win the Tour, I had to be willing to ride when no one else would ride. Number 8, facing hard truths. Confronting your identity and weaknesses is essential for personal growth. He said, I had to ask myself, if I live, who is it that I intend to be? Number 9, trust in the process. Mastering patience and trusting the journey are as important as hard work. Lance says, I had to learn how to race. Patience wasn't weakness. And number 10, living with integrity. Every hardship you face can be used as a force for good in the lives of others. He says, I felt I had a mission to serve others that I'd never had before. And this is after he battled cancer.
So Greg, as we mentioned at the beginning, Lance's legacy really is a paradox. So what are your top 10 life lessons to avoid from Lance Armstrong's story?
Number 1, ignoring early signs. Denying physical symptoms can have severe consequences. He justifies this by saying, athletes ignore aches and pains. Everything hurts. Number 2, overconfidence masking insecurity. Bravado often hides deep-seated insecurities that can be detrimental. He said, I race with no respect. I didn't think I could afford to give up inches. Number 3, rationalizing unethical behavior. Justifying wrong actions can lead to a deeper moral compromise. He says, doping is an unfortunate fact of life in cycling. And again, this was prior to him coming clean about his own doping efforts. Number 4, letting ego lead to destructive choices. Unchecked ego can lead to risky decisions that jeopardize success. When suggested that he took it easy in the final time trial of the Tour de France, he said, Bill, who the fuck do you think you're talking to? I'm going to kick ass tomorrow. Number 5, avoiding reflection. Failure to reflect on mistakes can prevent personal growth. He says, I should have recognized something was wrong, but as a cyclist, denial is part of the sport. Number 6, neglecting emotional health. Ignoring mental and emotional well-being can have long-term consequences. He says, I was a bum. It wasn't light-hearted or free or happy. Number 7, allowing bitterness to fester. Holding on to resentment and bitterness can cloud your decision-making. He said, I sarcastically called it an 80% cancer tax. Number 8, avoiding help when needed. Trying to do everything alone can lead to unnecessary suffering. He says, it was a humbling realization I couldn't do this alone. Number 9, downplaying vulnerability. Failing to acknowledge vulnerability can stifle true personal growth. He says, I never intended to deprive myself again. I'd been given a second chance and I was determined to take advantage of it. But it wasn't fun. It was forced. And finally, number 10, resisting change. Refusing to adapt to changing circumstances can limit successes. He says, I wasn't ready. I should have recognised that my comeback attempt was bound to be fraught with psychological problems. Thank you so much for joining myself and Duncan on this episode. If you enjoyed it, we ask you just one thing. Share this with 2 people in your network, and for that, we are truly grateful. See you next time on Performers.